Hey everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Bonnie Christian. I'm an author and journalist and a fellow here at Defense Priorities, and I'll be moderating this panel today. Joining me today are panelists Danny Davis and Will Ruger, both also fellows at Defense Priorities. William Ruger is the president of the American Institute for Economic Research and a vet of the Afghanistan War. In 2020, he was President Trump's nominee to be the U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan. And Daniel Davis retired from the U.S. Army as a lieutenant colonel after 21 years of active service. He was deployed into combat zones 4 times in his career, including twice in Afghanistan, and was awarded a Bronze Star Medal for service in Afghanistan in 2011. In 2012, Danny returned from Afghanistan for the second time and published a report detailing how senior U.S. military and civilian leaders told the American public and Congress the war was going well, while in reality it was headed toward defeat. Danny has since become a regular foreign policy and military analyst on Fox News, CNN, and elsewhere, and his writing has been widely published in outlets including The Washington Post, The New York Times, and Politico. So we'll open with brief statements from Danny and then Will, and then turn to questions I've prepared, and finally, depending on the time we have left, open the floor to some questions from the audience, which you can put into the comments section for us to review while you're listening. So Danny, we'll start with you. You can take it away. Oh, he's still muted.
We're good to go? Okay. Thanks, Bonnie. I'm just super glad to be here. And I'm just glad that people are actually paying a lot of attention to this a year later, because there's so many lessons I think that bear learning, or at least bear focusing on, so that we understand what actually did happen, what didn't happen, and most importantly, make sure the bad things don't happen again in the future. As Bonnie mentioned in my bio there, I had 2 combat tours into Afghanistan, one in 2005, 2006, and a second one in 2010, 2011. The second one came at the height of the Obama surge, when David Petraeus was in charge of that of the mission there, and my particular job at that time was to be on the ground, and I traveled over 9,000 miles within Afghanistan in virtually every theater of operations that was important to the U.S. Army there, from the Northeast all the way down to the South, and nearly everywhere in between. So I really had a great view of what was going on. I got to spend a lot of time with literally hundreds of American soldiers, and everywhere from 2-star general all the way down to new private, going on ground patrols, talking to battalion commanders, company commanders, platoon leaders. Truly, I had a tremendous opportunity to develop a good sense of what was going on at every level in this war. And so when I tell you that things were not going as they were claimed up on Capitol Hill and in the public media, and by claims by many general officers, I think I have a pretty good ground view to be able to make that statement with some authority. In terms of what happened last year, I just want to back up a little bit, because I think it's important to point out what did happen and what didn't happen, what people knew at various times, and how things worked out the way they did. I first wrote in a detailed assessment, about a 60-page paper, in the fall of 2009, before Obama had made his decision to surge into Afghanistan. And I wrote, here's the conditions on the ground, and if we surge, if we go big, here's the things that are going to happen, that most likely will happen. And almost all of those did happen. In 2010, as far as I know, I was the first Western author to say, hey, if we don't make some substantive changes, we're going to lose the war in Afghanistan. And then, of course, in 2012, after I came back from that second deployment, I was very outspoken and direct in saying that our senior leaders were outright lying to us, that nothing was going the way they were claiming, and that we were sacrificing men in a mission that didn't even have a chance to succeed. And of course, in 2019, you had the Washington Post publish the Afghanistan papers, which even expanded on what I knew and what I had reported, that we were being lied to, that people knew that the war was not going well, and that they continued to say otherwise in public, and then they just continued to support the war and extend it. So when we saw a year ago this war fall apart, you had a lot of people that were at the time even wanting to jump on the current administration of President Biden and say, hey, you did this bad, and the reason for the collapse was because you did a poor job. Well, there's certainly some blame to go around for how this was conducted, and I'll get to that in just a second. But the reason why this thing fell apart was because of the rot of 20 plus years of bad strategy, bad tactics, and lies that we used to cover over that to make the American public and US Congress believe that actually things were succeeding. Because of all that, the fiction and the spin that had been going on for 2 decades finally just could not stand the light of day. And then we saw what actually I had observed pieces of while I was there in terms of the Taliban making deals with the Afghan military not to fight, to lay down. We just saw it widespread, and then the absolute collapse of both the Afghan government and the military that, again, we were routinely told was going the right way. Now, I throw a little bit of shade on President Obama for not getting out when he said he was going to by the end of his tour, for changing the mission from a military attainable one that Bush had started and then changed to nation building, which then made it militarily impossible and baked in failure. Obama deepened that with even more nation building, didn't get out. Then at least Trump set the clock ticking for a withdrawal after his time in office expired. I wish he had done it earlier, but at least he set the clock rolling. And if I can say the one thing that the Biden administration did wrong was that they didn't stick with that original May deadline. If they had just stuck with the deadline that was in there, almost certainly we would have been able to withdraw in order, and we would have had this extreme chaos that we had, because the Taliban weren't yet in a position to be able to make their move what they did. Those extra 6 months from May until August gave them time to set the stage so that when we were ready to leave, we didn't even have a chance to escape before the thing just fell apart. So it's important to point out that I can tell you, and we can get into these during the question and answer period, from a tactical perspective on the ground, I saw unquestionably that this was never going to be militarily successful. It didn't even have the capacity to be so. And look, I told many people at the time, and of course I published several things on it during my time in uniform. So when you now hear a number of general officers on this anniversary date claiming that, we didn't have enough patience. I think Petraeus was saying that we didn't have enough national stick-to-itiveness, or I can't remember the exact word he used. The General Keane saying, hey, we should have actually, maintained a sustainable stalemate, which is crazy because all of those things say we're going to stay there forever. We're never going to leave, and we're going to perpetuate the loss that we have for the previous 20 years. So I reject all of that. I can give you detailed reasons why I feel that way. But for now, that's my intro. And back to you, Bonnie.
Thanks so much, Danny. And over to you, Will.
Yeah, looking back at this last year, I feel very confident that withdrawal was the right thing for the United States to do because the war had no longer served American interests. And I think it's important to kind of sum up what those were that justified us being there in the first place, because I do think that we had a solid, realist rationale for going into Afghanistan after 9/11, right? We needed to punish the Taliban for its state sponsorship of Al-Qaeda. We needed to attrit Al-Qaeda as a terrorist organization with an intent and capability to harm the United States. And we needed to kill or capture Osama bin Laden. The thing is, though, is that we achieved those goals early on, and especially after we killed Osama bin Laden, under President Obama's tenure in office. So we had achieved those goals long ago. But the problem is that other war aims had been smuggled into the war, into our efforts. In particular, they had done so through a false theory of what Afghanistan required in order for us to meet our security needs. Or what had happened is that other interests were smuggled in, right? Other views about the kind of intrinsic desirability of liberalization and values promotion. But those aims were disconnected from our national interests and what was possible to achieve. And so it was unnecessary and not worth continuing to fight and die for to try to do that. And Danny referenced this, right? Once we engaged on that bigger project, the military was not going to be successful. So we won the war we needed to fight, and we lost the war that wasn't necessary for us. And so finally, we were able to get out with President Trump and Ambassador Khalilzad signing the Doha Agreement. And then President Biden, after dithering, ultimately making the right call and justifying it for the right reasons using a realist rationale rather than the kind of idealistic rationales he tends to use in other areas. Now, the only remaining national interest in Afghanistan is counterterrorism. We still have a counterterrorism goal there. And the thing is that we can effectively meet that goal through our over-the-horizon capabilities. And that was borne out most recently with the Zawahiri strike. So when people like David Petraeus and others talk about how we won't be able to collect intelligence, we won't be able to use kinetic force without having a military presence in Afghanistan, this has been proven wrong by the targeting of Al-Qaeda's kind of chief operative there, or chief architect, Zawahiri. Now, again, those who say it wasn't right to leave Afghanistan, I think suffer under, or because the Afghans would suffer under the Taliban, or that we had to protect those fragile gains in human rights or democracy. I think they're looking at war and the state the wrong way. It isn't the role of the American government, to fight wars, to secure goods, or to undermine evils, unless they're required by our vital interests. It's not right to send America's young men and women to go into combat for kind of illusory goals disconnected for the whole purpose of having a military and having a government in the first place, which is to secure our nation, to secure what we entered into our constitutional order in the first place to achieve. So I think it's important to put this particular war within that context, and also within the broader grand strategy debate. So regardless of whether you're a primacist or a realist and restrainer, it's important, I think, that we left, right? If you're a primacist, you understand that China is our most important adversary, and you want to pivot to actively engaging and securing alliances and combating the spread or the growth of Chinese power. If you're a realist and a restrainer, it's still the right thing, including if you think, again, that China is our most important strategic adversary, but you want to follow a much more prudentialist approach than primacy towards dealing with that challenge to American national security. Because again, our vital national interests weren't at play in Afghanistan other than that CT mission that we can conduct over the horizon. And we need to pivot out of the grand strategy that had us in these Middle Eastern wars in the first place towards meeting our our broader national security ends that are more important, because you have to make trade-offs in any type of responsible policy.
Thanks, Will, and thank you both. I think it's a really great combo that we've set up here to have Danny providing sort of that on-the-ground tactical perspective and the bigger strategic view from you. So moving on to some questions. First, I'm curious about what has surprised you both. What has surprised you the most about the developments in the last 12 months since the Afghanistan withdrawal? And perhaps also what has surprised you least? What was exactly as you expected it to be?
Well, I suppose I don't know that anything has really surprised me, so I can't really say that. But one of the things I've found the most discouraging, I think I'll start with that one, is that, for 20 years we kept saying that the center of gravity is the Afghan population, and we care about the Afghan people, and we didn't want to leave because we didn't want to leave them to the Taliban, et cetera. And now that in order to continue to punish the Taliban basically for winning, we have continued to put the population at a horrible situation. I still have friends on the ground there that have not been able to get out, and they tell me that the quality of life there is just insanely bad. And I mean, any news report can tell you the same thing. And, just releasing the money that actually belongs to the Afghan government, it's now a different Afghan government. But, under this claim that, well, no, we can't reward terrorism or we can't allow these people to be able to succeed. But look, that cost the Afghan people, because whether we like the Taliban or not, they are the government of Afghanistan. And look, and I think to Will's point, which I thought was so important, is that the reason we have a military is to defend America and to defend our shores and defend our people and our vital national interests wherever they may be in the world. And our vital national interests are still not at stake in Afghanistan. And by allowing the Taliban just to have access to the funds that are needed for millions of Afghan people who, were victims of the war before, they're still being victims now, I don't think is going to cause us any difficulty at all, because it's not even related to our over the horizon capacity and our unblinking global eye, where we're looking out for the ability to target any enemy of the United States, anybody who's a direct threat. It doesn't matter where they are. we'll be able to go find them. Releasing money to the Taliban that belongs to the Afghan government that would benefit the people is not going to put that at risk. And I really would like to see that change, because it would help the Afghan people and it wouldn't harm us.
All right. Well, so then next, a frequent line in commentary on last year's withdrawal has been basically, well, yes, it was good to leave, but the execution was terrible. And Danny, you touched on this a little bit already, so perhaps let's start with Will. I'm wondering if you think that that is a fair critique. Could the execution have been significantly better? And if so, how?
I mean, I think it's easy to Monday morning quarterback these things. And I think inevitably it was going to be messy in terms of our withdrawal. That being said, I think the implementation left a lot to be desired. And a big problem was that we dithered. The fact is that we could have withdrawn earlier. If the Trump administration had remained in power, then we would have seen an earlier withdrawal, perhaps by the May deadline that was part of the Doha Agreement. And in that situation, the Taliban would have had less operational momentum than they ultimately had when the withdrawal occurred, and would have been in less of a position to take Kabul before we left. And so again, it's easy to have a counterfactual in which everything works out better the way you would have liked to have seen it. Again, it was most likely going to be messy in one way or another, but I do think we would have been in a better position had we not waited longer and had stuck to the original Doha agreement.
Oh, I think Danny's responding too.
Yeah, there's two actually separate issues there. I've already talked about part of it. We'll just hit another part of it right there. There's two other issues that need to be borne out. One, on the positive side, we have to recognize that, up until just 2 weeks before this thing ended, we had been operating on the assumption that we would have a clean withdrawal and that the government would still be in existence and that the military would still be operational. So we had a timeline to where everything was going to be going down to get out by the August 31st original deadline. And the military was on that path to get that done. Well, when things completely fell apart on, I think it was the 15th of August, now then you have complete and total chaos. And then I think from an operational perspective, I think the Army did a tremendous job to be able to change on the fly to basically a withdrawal under pressure. And just being cascaded with, potentially or tens of thousands of civilians clamoring to get out, and then the chaos that ensued there. So I think under those terrible, terrible conditions, they did, practically speaking, a pretty good job. But the bigger problem that I have, back to the other side of the ledger, is that these things should have been seen coming. And, you still had, at least publicly, our senior military leaders, to include the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, not even 2 weeks before the collapse, we're still saying, no, Afghanistan is still going to remain, the government is still going to remain intact. The military is still going to they're still fighting for their country. I mean, President Biden said the same thing publicly. He said, you're not going to see a Saigon moment with helicopters pulling off the top of the embassy. And of course, that's exactly what happened. And you have to ask, why did our senior leaders not know that this was coming? Because look, a lot of this stuff, I mean, you could just read in the papers and you could have seen that a lot of the district centers were falling pretty rapidly before that. We should have known that this was, soon going to take over entire provinces, and then that the whole thing could collapse. Because like I said earlier, I'd seen some of this stuff happening in 2010. So in terms of what the Taliban and the Afghan military kind of deals they were making. So this has been a long known issue that was going on. And it's troubling that our senior leaders seem to be caught flat-footed.
Next, I'd like to turn to the topic of credibility. I think we've seen a lot of claims that U.S. credibility suffered because we withdrew from Afghanistan, even though we'd been there for nearly 20 years. And I'm wondering what you make of that argument, and more broadly, how should we think about credibility as a factor in our foreign policy?
Yeah, there's a real disconnect between how a lot of folks in the Washington establishment view credibility and actually how scholars have understood credibility. Scholars have talked about how credibility is based on the kind of local balance of power, the local interests that are at stake in any conflict, and that we don't necessarily look across those kind of borders to other issues to judge that. So, for example, if you think about Afghanistan, not only did we stay there 20 years, so people, if it did cross borders, people should have said, wow, if they're willing to spend 20 years on a strategic backwater like Afghanistan, imagine what they might do in this other theater where they have more at stake. But again, that's not really how it works. What works is that people look at the local situation. So for example, something like Japan. Japan is clearly more important to the United States and our interests than Afghanistan was. And so the Chinese or the North Koreans or whoever, they're going to view our commitment or our relationship with Japan based on those local factors that relate to our interests, the strength of them, and the local balance of power more than they are going to look to what happened in a strategic backwater like Afghanistan. And I'd also look to this issue that you've seen raised. Well, the Russians were emboldened by seeing us leave Afghanistan, and that's why they moved on Ukraine. I mean, that just seems to be completely in a vacuum from actually what was happening in Ukraine, the issues at stake between Russia and Ukraine, and America's commitments around the world. I mean, we had a more important case to be made for the rationale why we were in Afghanistan in the first place, just as we have a more important rationale for why we might want to support Poland or Germany or France vis-a-vis Russia than Ukraine, which was not an ally of ours and is still not an ally of ours, and in which there were local issues between Russia and Ukraine that led to this, not least of which is Putin's aggression, that many people who are primicists argue was the root cause of the struggle. So if it was merely about Putin's aggression, and we didn't have an alliance, and there was no sense that American interests were critical to Ukraine or that Ukraine was critical to our strategic interests, then why would what we did in Afghanistan really matter to the outcome of that conflict or the outcome of that crisis? So it's just, I think, a lot of poppycock to think that what happened in Afghanistan translates to these other theaters in that way.
All right. Now, a major storyline about Afghanistan over the past year has been this humanitarian crisis, including widespread hunger, which, as Danny mentioned, is attributable, at least in part, to the U.S. freeze on Afghan government funds to keep them out of Taliban hands. And I'm wondering, Danny already argued that we should release that money. I'm wondering what you all think U.S.-Taliban relations should look like going forward. Should we treat them like we would any other, reprehensible government that isn't the government that we want, but it is the government that the country has?
Yeah, I think you hit it right there on the top there at the end of your question. We deal with governments we don't like all the time. I mean, because look, there's 190 recognized governments in the United Nations, and I bet we don't have great relations with all of them. So there's a bunch of them, as we have throughout history. With the Khrushchev period, with the Kim Il-sung in North Korea, with Maduro right now, with Castro before in Cuba. I mean, there's lots of people we have to deal with that we don't like, but we have an obligation to do that. We don't get to choose the governments that are around the world. We just get to choose how we react to them. And I think, going back to something Will said a couple of times, it needs to be front and center here. It needs to be based on American interests. And if there's something in our interest to have an engagement with a foreign government, then we need to do that. We don't have to like them. We don't have to be their friend. But if engagement with them can improve American national security, can improve American economic opportunities, then that's what we should be doing. This whole idea that we don't talk to anybody we don't like is short-sighted, and it's counterproductive to us, and it costs us unnecessarily.
Yeah, so I thought I was going to disagree with Danny, and maybe we'd get into a little bit of a debate, but then he finished really strong there. So, I don't think that we owe the Taliban anything, right? The Taliban was our adversary and our enemy in Afghanistan. The Taliban was complicit with Al-Qaeda on 9/11, and I'm glad that we punished them severely in the years after that. And I think that the reason why I thought Danny finished so strong is that the thing we have to look to now is how do we best advance our interests? And when it came to killing and capturing Taliban, and that was in our interest, then we needed to do that. When it comes to now whether we need to engage, then I think we need to do that as well. And Danny was right that there may be opportunities, there will be and are opportunities to cooperate as we need to when we have a kind of shared goal. And I think the Taliban understands some of the challenges to their own country from getting too cozy with anti-American terrorists. And if there are opportunities to cooperate on counterterrorism, we ought to take those opportunities. But we also have to remember that we're going to need to hit targets in Afghanistan as we see fit, consistent with our national interests. And even if the Afghan government, the Taliban, is going to claim that we're violating their sovereignty, well, again, there are good reasons to respect sovereignty, and there are oftentimes reasons when you have to violate other states' sovereignty, and we have to make sure that we do so carefully. But when we need to, we need to. And so, killing someone like Zawahiri, I think, was important to do so, and justified penetration of that sovereignty norm that is usually important for realist reasons to appreciate, or at least to genuflect to when necessary.
And we'll return to the Zawahiri strike in just a moment, but first, one more question, sort of on the humanitarian theme. Danny, I know you've written repeatedly about the need to bring Afghan interpreters who supported U.S. troops to the United States to keep them safe and repay them for their assistance. I'm wondering, first, has there been progress on that front in the last year? And then more broadly for both of you, are there humanitarian or refugee obligations or even interests you think the United States has in relation to the Afghan people generally, or specific groups like the interpreters after so many years of war and occupation?
Yeah, especially in terms of the interpreters and the people that we gave promises to, I think that should be black and white, ironclad, yes. And unfortunately, there was a great deal of energy and emphasis on it around the time of the withdrawal, and even initially thereafter, where the government was putting lots of effort and resources to getting that done. And as I mentioned at the top of this show here, I actually still have a friend who has not yet left, and we've been trying to get him out since about 2012. And there seems to always be some problem. Now then, with this, new emphasis, it looked like he was on the cusp about March or so. But then there's just seems to be a lack of interest in the State Department in the areas where they're supposed to be doing that, and they just haven't been taking much action. And I can't imagine that his case is somehow unique. I bet there's lots of people that now then we just don't seem to really be paying a lot of attention, and that on a personal level and also a professional level, I found that problematic. On the second issue, I'm not as, I guess, as hardcore of a person as I wouldn't say that we have an obligation, as some do, to take Afghan refugees into the United States. I think that we shouldn't prevent them. I don't think there should be any special case, because there's literally millions around the world every day that want to get in, or every year. And so we should take that on, we should have a good, actually, immigration policy. I think there's not much debate that's broken across the board and needs to be fixed. And I wish to God that both the Republicans and Democrats could figure some way to come up with some kind of reform on our immigration policies. But I don't think that we need to make a special category for the Afghan refugees as opposed to those from any other place in the world.
Yeah, I think when it comes to people that we made promises to, I agree with Danny, right? It's important that we do so. Again, not just because you're being nice, but because it's actually prudential to do so, because you would like to see others who might look to this and worry about cooperating in the future with us. So we need to do that. But I think it's morally supererogatory, right, to let refugees in to the United States relative to, say, refugees from other places. The fact is the United States was attacked by the Afghan government, and while the people of Afghanistan aren't necessarily complicit in that, our efforts in Afghanistan were justified in the first place. And I don't necessarily think that there is there are only certain kind of minimal moral kind of responsibilities I think you have at that point. You need to follow, obviously, the rules of war that we have signed on to, and meet some of those kind of higher ethical norms that our country is committed to as a liberal democracy. But I don't think that it necessarily means that anybody who wants to come to the United States because of the fact that Afghanistan is a relatively failed country in many ways, that we are kind of morally obligated to let them into the United States, especially absent a more comprehensive immigration policy that makes sense for America's future.
All right, now turning, as promised, to some airstrikes. So there have been two prominent U.S. airstrikes in Afghanistan in the last year. There was the one late last August that killed, during the withdrawal, that killed 10 civilians, most of them children, and for which no one involved suffered consequences following a Pentagon investigation. And then, as you mentioned, Will, about a month ago, there was the strike that killed Al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri. And meanwhile, data from Air Wars, I just recently found out, which tracks U.S. strikes using independent reports, not only the official acknowledgements, shows that the Biden administration has dramatically wound down the drone war and other airstrikes, not only in Afghanistan, but across the greater Middle East. And so I'm wondering what you all anticipate the future of U.S. air war in Afghanistan will be.
Well, I'll tell you what I hope it is. I hope that we won't flinch at hitting targets that are required for our interests. And I don't mean like every Tom, Dick, and Harry that's there. I mean those who are particularly important to the ability for Al-Qaeda or other terrorist organizations to carry out strikes in the United States. Because our job isn't to go after every terrorist in the world. I mean, that was one of the problems with the idea of a global war on terror, right? There's all kinds of terrorist organizations and individuals in the world, and some of them have the intent to harm the United States, and some of them have the capability, but not the intent to harm the United States. And the ones that we need to target are those with the intent and capability. And again, we have to make hedges around that sometimes to make sure that we're not missing out on opportunities or missing out like we did in the 90s, frankly, at hitting targets that could harm us. But I think we have to be careful and not just go after low-level targets with expensive capabilities and in ways that could redound against you, because doing that triage around the most important targets, somewhat important, and then not really important targets is what we have to do. In terms of terrorism, there's that old saying by Tom Sowell, there are no solutions, there's only trade-offs. I think that's the right approach when we think about counterterrorism.
And Danny, we lost you for a second. I don't know if you heard the question, but it was I was just briefly discussing the two, I think, best known airstrikes that we've seen in Afghanistan since around this time last year, and then asking what you anticipate the future of the U.S. air war in Afghanistan will be.
Bonnie, I'm sorry. If you're talking, I can't hear anything anyone's saying right now. I apologize.
Oh.
I can see you, but I can't hear either one of you.
All right. Will, can you hear me? Well, now I can't hear Will. Oh, he's muted. All right, we'll give Danny a second to try to come back, and hopefully things will be in better shape.
Sure, and I'll cover for Danny, although of course I can't fill in for him completely. But in terms of the future, I mean, like you said, it does seem that President Biden has reduced the number of strikes that you've seen. The question is whether that reduction is good or bad to meeting our interests around the world, particularly when it comes to targeting the kind of terrorists that I talked about earlier. I don't think that there's an ideal number. There's not an ideal level, right? Like, oh, a low level of targeting is the right one, is the wrong way to think about it, as would be, say, a high level, because it all depends on the targets. And so if you told me that the Biden administration was unwilling to take punches or to give punches that we ought to be, then I would worry about that. But I do like the idea of some prudentialism when it comes to this, because if you're just going to play whack-a-mole with every low-level terrorist around the world, that's not necessarily the best approach. Nor would it be like the 90s when we were avoiding hitting targets that we ought to with more severity. And again, it's easy to Monday morning quarterback because we didn't know 9/11 was coming. But I do think it's important that you have to be willing to to send the punch. And again, I'm a conservative, but I would give President Obama and President Biden credit when they had the chance to hit bin Laden, and when they had the chance to hit Zawahiri, they took the hit, right? They made the call, and we delivered that punch.
Now, not to jinx anything, but airstrikes aside, I wonder if you all think that Washington is really and truly done with war in Afghanistan, at least for the foreseeable future. I'm thinking, for comparison, of how we've had multiple ends of combat operations in Iraq, only to escalate again as conditions on the ground changed. On the other hand, there was never such a complete U.S. withdrawal from Iraq, so maybe the comparison isn't fair. What do you guys think? Is it really over?
Yeah, I think that this one is. I think that there's so much recognition that it was a failure. It was a military failure. It was a diplomatic failure. and the ability to go back in, because there's now an enemy government in charge. It's almost not even like the Syria situation where you had, a friendly Syrian Democratic Force that you could, put troops in there within that footprint or whatever. There's nothing like that in Afghanistan. We would have to go in from scratch and support even the foundation of a base with extraordinary amounts of logistics. I don't think anybody's going to do that. No one sees a reason to. And this strike against Zawahiri, I think, would undermine anybody's thought that would go in again, because they see that if we need to, we can take a strike and take them out of there. But I think that there's enough recognition that this was a long time. The withdrawal was a long time in coming, and that we don't want to go back and deepen that mistake again. Though I think that since you brought it up, I would very much like to see the Iraq and the Syrian missions for the same logic come to an end as well. And we certainly should be doing that, because those troops there, we've seen in recent days, they're taking risk every day that a rocket or a drone strike is gonna hit some of our troops. And it's just anguishing to me as a former deployed soldier to see our troops just basically sitting on the ground there waiting to see if any of them are killed by an enemy strike when they're not performing any duty at all that benefits the United States. That's what was happening so long in Afghanistan, and Biden made the right call to get out, but we need to apply that same logic in Iraq and Syria. Thanks for that opportunity.
All right, and then lastly, I'm wondering if you could advise the Biden administration right now and make sure they learn at least one big lesson from the war in Afghanistan, including last year's withdrawal. What would that lesson be?
I think the lesson they should draw is that no Americans have been killed in Afghanistan since the withdrawal itself. There were obviously the 13 Marines, a sailor, and a soldier that were killed in that process. But since then, the United States' interests have been supported with no casualties. And if we had stayed in this conflict, there would have been casualties. I believe the casualties would have ramped up significantly because the Taliban would have seen that we had broken the Doha agreement, that we had agreed to withdraw, and they would have ramped those up, and we would have had troops there that were not in the best position. But since then, right, of course, because we left, and our interests have been perfectly fine. And I think that means that you could rest comfortably that you're doing the right thing. Now, politically, they got a lot of heat for the implementation. So I think it's important for them to distinguish, you got to get the implementation right, even if your decision is sound. So when it comes to Syria or Iraq, I hope they won't say, look, we don't want to put egg on our face by potential implementation problems. We're just going to make sure that we get it right. But we should rest assured that this is the best thing to do for America's people and our interests, because it's right, like Danny said, or it's wrong rather, to have our troops just sitting there, taking these shots or potentially taking shots from, various actors, whether it's Iranian-backed proxies in Syria or it's, these, various factions within Iraq. Do the right thing, and you'll go down in history as the guy that did that. And I think that, as far as I'm concerned, the history books will look kindly upon Biden's withdrawal decision from Afghanistan, particularly because it is a bipartisan withdrawal decision. President Trump is the one that set us on this path, and President Biden is the one who completed it. And I think both parties should feel better about this end than feeling worse about it.
Yeah, and if I can just kind of tag on to that, the lesson that I think, aside from what Will just said, is that I hope that this government and all future American governments recognize that if you're going to use the instrument of war, that you need to have identifiable, attainable military objectives that you send there to do that are so important that they are worth risking the lives of our service member and the lives of those that are going to be on the ground there. And that you go in, you execute the mission, you end the mission, and you withdraw. You don't change the mission when you get on the ground. You don't look for something to do. And that's pretty much what we did there. Bush was the first egregious violator of that. Obama followed in his footsteps. And it wasn't until President Trump, recognized that. And then President Biden agreed with it. And he ended the withdrawal that we finally got out of there. Let's make that the situation now. Look, let's apply it right away in Syria and in Iraq and in all these places in our Africa that we're in. I mean, if you can't say here is a vital national interest of the United States that the application of lethal military power is a valid and necessary tool to use, then those troops that are there need to come out, and we don't need to send them in the future. There's a bunch of ways that we can, safeguard our security. And then there's also just the fact that, look, we just don't get to do everything that we want to. There's a lot of things that are interest of America that are not vital national interest of America. And we can't use military power or threats of power every time that our preferences don't get followed. And I think that's something else that needs to be, learned. That's probably not a relearn, but that's a learn. Because that is almost across the board bad for our interest. It costs us money, it costs us troops, it costs us prestige. I mean, there's just so many downsides to it and almost no upsides to it that can't be handled in better ways. So those are the things that I really hope that we learn from this disaster.
All right, and I have a question here coming in. Given Pakistan's role in providing safe haven for the Taliban throughout the war in Afghanistan, how should the United States approach relations with Islamabad today?
So what I would say is that Pakistan is a very important country in this area. And I don't think that we want to get ideological about how we approach it. I mean, sure, just like with Iran, it would be, we feel some, kind of desire for revenge for the support that they gave to the Taliban or that Iranians provided to insurgent forces in Iraq. But the challenge of that type of kind of emotional thinking is that you may not pursue things most prudentially going forward. And Afghanistan is both a country we have challenges with, and they're a country that we have some similar interests with. And not least, we have an interest in making sure that the government in Pakistan does not become dominated by even worse actors, especially given it's a nuclear power. And so I think we have to tread cautiously when it comes to that. But we also have to make sure that we have a long memory, right? We have to remember that they played the Afghan war in a way, both sides of the fence, and make sure that we're not kind of duped into thinking that there's some kind of sacred alliance. I mean, that's the problem of thinking of alliances or partners as sacred, the way President Biden has talked about allies. It's much more complicated. Alliances and partnerships are means to ends. We're not best friends, and it's not something that we owe them beyond what is necessary, to kind of meet our needs. And our needs are complicated when it comes to Pakistan.
All right. Danny, did you want to weigh in on that? If not, I've got another question for you. Okay. For Danny then, can you share your thoughts on the idea that withdrawal emboldened Russia and China? Will touched on that a bit, but there's some interest in hearing from you too.
Yeah, there's no connection whatsoever. I mean, it's hard to improve on what Will said, but I'll just reinforce the key parts of it. There is that the issue between the United States and Afghanistan and the Taliban had to do with the issue between the United States, Afghanistan, and Taliban. It didn't have to do with anybody else. And Putin is not going to be sitting there thinking, boy, if only the U.S. had stayed in Afghanistan, I wouldn't have gone into Ukraine. Obviously, that's absurd to even say out loud. And that's how absurd it actually is, because Putin went into Ukraine because of issues between Russia and Ukraine and Russia and NATO. And those are the issues that exclusively had to do it. And Putin is not going to, number one, he recognized that there is no mutual defense treaty between the United States or NATO and Ukraine. So he knew that there was no risk that attacking Ukraine would be attacking NATO with Article 5 like it would be with any other NATO member. So the issues that happened in Ukraine had nothing to do with it. In fact, and I'll point out that I had a particular conversation with a diplomat from a U.S. ally, a very strong ally, and when this Afghan war ended, a year ago, and I asked them what they thought about it, this whole issue of credibility, because there's the other issue of did our allies think that we're less reliable, et cetera. And he said something I think is really important and it applies across the board here. He said, we weren't surprised you got out in 2021. We were surprised you stayed that long, because we didn't see any vital national interest of the United States. And it was puzzling to us why you kept putting so much energy in something that wasn't even important to your interest. Putin likewise looks at that and he sees what is America's interest in this issue right here, and not did they do something over here that probably didn't make sense for them to stay. I mean, Putin could say, we only stayed 10 years before we recognized how foolish it was, and you doubled that. So I understand why you got out, and no one is going to think that that means that he shouldn't have, that made it easier for him to go into Ukraine. It really doesn't even matter.
All right. Well, I am not seeing any further questions. So why don't I just give you guys, undoubtedly because we were so thorough, why don't I give you both just a couple minutes to offer any final closing thoughts, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, it's hard to just reinforce enough that this mission should have ended a long time ago. I think that probably the best case could have been made that the war should have ended in the summer of 2002, after the valid military objectives were accomplished. And at that time, the Taliban weren't just weakened, they were utterly annihilated. There was no Taliban. So the military could have withdrawn then without any problem, because there was no more enemy to worry about. And then the Afghan people could have formed whatever kind of government they wanted to. We could have given economic and humanitarian assistance. And this whole issue and thousands of American troops would have never have been killed or wounded. But as you know, I said in 2010, and again in 2012, we should have ended the war then. And it's just a tragedy that we just would not do it because it was politically difficult, or for people were afraid, or God only knows what. And I just hope that future administrations learn from the pain and the anguish and the cost that has been levied on the U.S. military and on their families, that we always claim to love the troops and, you know, and help them and all this kind of stuff. And yet it's been on their backs primarily that the burden fell, that our unwillingness to recognize just basic combat realities and perpetuated this war so long, that they were the bill payers for this. And I hope that future generations and administrations learn that those lessons and don't repeat them.
Yeah, I guess what I would say is that idealism gets people killed. And the problem of our approach to Afghanistan is that we engaged on kind of tilting with these idealistic windmills, and we really shouldn't have. And unfortunately, you know, many of the people that Danny and I served with had to pay the ultimate sacrifice or were harmed in that process. And when the United States also spent a lot of money there that could have been better used on domestic priorities or on other foreign policy priorities. And so the last thing I would say is we have to think better about trade-offs. The United States has a lot of different interests in the world and at home, and we have to make better trade-offs about them. China is our most important strategic adversary. We need to pivot more resources to that aspect of our grand strategy. And we need to rationalize our approach to the Middle East. The Middle East just isn't as important as it used to be to the United States. And the idealistic project that we embarked on after, you know, especially in Iraq, as you saw in Bush's second inaugural, that these things are dangerous, they get people killed, and we should avoid them in the future.
All right, well, thank you both. Thank you for bringing your expertise to this important issue. And with that, we are going to sign off. You can learn more at defensepriorities.org if you're not already familiar with Will and Danny's work.